Hey, what's up everyone? Gabe here. This video is my mostly solo ride of the MABDR, done in the fall of 2022. The MABDR is the Mid-Atlantic Backcountry Discovery Route, and it runs from the Virginia-Tennessee border up to the Pennsylvania-New York border. I rode it south to north in that direction, which means I started in Damascus, Virginia, and I finished in Lawrenceville, Pennsylvania. I rode it during the last week of September and the first week of October of 2022. The BDR itself took me 5 days to run, but I had to add 3 days to get there from Montreal where I live, and then another 2 days to get home when I was at the end. So the whole trip was 10 days and 9 nights long. I'm going to focus the video on the actual BDR rather than the way there and back, but I do want to call out what you're watching right now. This footage is from a road called the Back of the Dragon, which I hit right as I was coming up to Damascus the day before I started the BDR. Google Maps picked this route for me just by having it set to not take the freeway. It was a really cool surprise. I'd heard of the tail of the dragon before, but never the back of the dragon, which I guess they're connected. I know the tail of the dragon is in Tennessee. This one was in Virginia. I leaned over pretty hard on some of these corners though, because when I got to Damascus and I checked out my bike, I saw quite a lot of damage done to the edge knobs on my rear tire, mostly on right turns, so clearly I'm more willing to take right turns hard than left, but there you go. Before we get into the ride itself, let's talk about the bike a little bit. I did the MABDR on a 2021 Honda CRF450RL. If you're unfamiliar, this is a dual sport bike based on Honda's CRF450X Enduro race bike platform. It's a very off-road oriented dual sport bike, a dirt bike with lights as the common cliche goes. Unlike Honda's other dual sports such as the CRF450RL, the 450 is a much more rough and tumble beast since it wasn't built on a street bike's platform. This is both positive and negatives, but we'll save that for later. In order to turn this lightweight bike into a lightweight adventure bike capable of riding long distances, I've made several modifications, and I'll go over them here quickly. I've done videos about almost all these mods, and if you go back in my channel, you can see the videos where I talk about them in a lot more detail if that's something that interests you. So, first I upgraded the fuel tank from 7.5 liters to 11. This gives the bike an effective range of about 200 kilometers, fully loaded. In American, this is 2 gallons to 3 and a range of 125 miles. I also carried 2 1-liter MSR fuel bottles, so 2 extra liters of gas as a reserve, but I never ended up using it. I've got a Seat Concepts Comfort Low seat. It is more comfortable, largely by being wider than the stock seat. And it also shaves about a ½ inch off the stock height, which is good because it's a very tall bike. I've got the Adventure Spec Mini fairing. This is the small white windscreen with the GPS mount on it, and you can see it very prominently in all my footage from my helmet cam. It serves, like I said about it before, it's the GPS thing, so that's what its purpose is. It holds the GPS of the bike. It does this securely. The windscreen functionality, I don't know how much it's really blocking or buffeting that it's preventing. It's hard to say. But the GPS was the important thing, and it did a great job there. I've got heated grips on the bike, and not much to say, but they worked, and it was cold some of the mornings, so I was happy to have them. And the last adventure focus mod I would say would have to be the Moscow Moto Reckless 80-liter luggage system. And I'm not going to lie, this is easily the most expensive mod that this bike has, more than all the other stuff I just mentioned put together. There's other options that are cheaper from Giant Loop and Tusk and some other companies, but I took the Moscow Motos because they're proven reliable, and for me it's a long-term investment. Any other bike I buy, light dual sport, bigger adventure bike, whatever, I know this Reckless 80 is going to work on it, and I'll keep it for hopefully a lifetime. I know you can crash in it and it'll keep working, so there you go. I packed all my stuff for the whole 10-day trip into luggage, and while I didn't have a tent because I didn't camp, I would have had room for one if I needed to bring it. For general mods to the bike that are not adventure riding specific, I'd say the biggest ones are probably the exhaust system and the ECU. For exhaust, I did a FMF Megabomb header and a Q4 pipe, and the ECU is a Vortex unit tuned by Tokyo Mods. Together, this goes a long way to making the bike a lot smoother, and especially dealing with the low-speed stall-out, flame-out issues that the 450L has become infamous for. They do also add a bit of extra horsepower, and they reduce weight too, so that's pretty cool. Specifically for the ECU, I ran with the power optimized mapping, and I made this choice because I was doing tons of road mileage basically. just getting to the BDR, and then even on the BDR, a lot of the stuff is basically road or maybe gravel roads, so might as well just have more power and make it easy to deal with cars or whatever when I needed to. You could actually change it on the side of the trail if you wanted to switch to like the more enduro mapping, but I never had to, and it would be a little finicky. It's a very small screw. And the final thing on the bike that I'd talk about is that I used a Dunlop D606 tire for the back and a Pirelli MT21 for the front. These are pretty good tires. I like this pair. I've used them before. They performed well, but they don't last long, and by the end of the trip, they're finished and I had to replace them. I spent so much time telling you about my bike and its mods because I want you to have an understanding of what my BDR experience was like. I think one of the major factors that can influence a trip like this has to be the bike selection and the bike setup. If you're anything like me, there's a really good chance you found this video because you're interested in doing the MABDR for yourself. You want to see, of course, what the terrain and the riding look like, and you want to see what the challenges might be, but you also want to see what setups other people are using because you're thinking about what kind of setup you might want to use or what you have today, and would that be appropriate for this kind of ride for you and your context. In that note, it's worth noting that I'm not a very experienced off-road rider. I spent quite a lot of years now riding street, but off-road's pretty new to me. I just haven't had a ton of saddle time off anything past really like gravel roads. So when I started, my confidence wasn't super high, but having a very light, soft luggage setup with like a bike that I knew I could pick back up and I knew wouldn't break anything important if it fell down a little bit, that really helped with my confidence. I used to own a KTM 790 Adventure, and it had these like big aluminum hard panniers, and if I tried to do the MABDR on that bike, I really can't imagine I would have had the same kind of confidence. So, you know, I think that covers this section. I'm going to talk more about the bike and the setup and how it all performed for me, what I liked and what I didn't like and all that at the end of the video, but I think you've got a feel for what I was riding now and what my experience was like. So now we're going to start and we're going to go on to the BDR itself. Day one of the BDR was actually my fourth full day on the trip, so by the time I got to Damascus, I'd ridden well over the CRF450's oil change interval. The night before, I stayed at the Dancing Bear Inn in Damascus. The owner, Pat, is an avid rider and a BDR supporter, and he has a bike shop with a lift out back. I emailed in advance, and I asked him if I could do an oil change in his shop since I was riding down from Canada on a pretty silly bike. He was very accommodating and even helped me do that oil change, as well as help me inspect the bike. It's where I noticed those chopped up knobs that I showed before, and it's also where I found a pretty big amount of metal dust inside the sprocket cover, the front sprocket cover. And of course that dust is coming from the chain in the sprockets. It turns out my bike was eating its rear sprocket alive. I didn't exactly have a spare with me, so I went on anyway, but I knew I'd have to change the drivetrain out after the trip. So anyway, if you ever watch this, Pat, thank you very much for all your help. Fresh oil in the machine, I finally started the BDR. The route gets you into the woods pretty quickly, but it took 15 minutes or so before the pavement turned into gravel. At that point, the road narrowed significantly and I was climbing and descending frequently, clearly getting into the Allegheny Mountains. Once in a while, there'd be a paved section going through some farmland, but it would then duck back into the canopy onto the forest roads running through George Washington and Jefferson National Forests. This was my first time riding the 450 off pavement for more than a few kilometers in one stretch. It was a good way to get used to how the bike felt, since there wasn't anything really technical beyond a few sharp downhill switchbacks during section 1. There were a couple of deep gravel sections which felt pretty floaty, but they weren't a big deal. Nothing compared to like some of the really loose sand I've ridden through before and had quite a lot of trouble with. I've never mastered the really loose surface stuff, but those floaty gravel sections were manageable. I was pretty vigilant in stopping for gas anytime I saw a gas station, even if I still had a half tank left. And it was at the first such gas stop that I met two gentlemen who were riding an African Twin and a Triumph Tiger. We talked a bit, and then we would continue to pass each other as the day went on, including at the end point of Section 1, Newport, Virginia. They told me they were a bit nervous about one of the main highlights of Section 2, Tub Run Road. It hadn't rained lately, so I wasn't especially worried about it. I started Section 2 after eating lunch, and it's one of the shortest sections on the BDR, just 79 miles or 127 kilometers. That said, it still took about the same amount of time to finish as Section 1 did, because there's more off-pavement sections and they were slower and more technical as a whole. I got to the start of this infamous Tub Run road around 3:45 in the afternoon and quickly encountered my two friends from earlier. The road itself was pretty good, not really more technical or challenging than the earlier stuff had been, but what was notable about it is that it stayed at that level of challenge for much longer. The last few kilometers had lots of deep gravel to traverse as well, so all in all it definitely was the toughest part of my first day. By the time I'd reached the end though, I felt accomplished and felt much more comfortable riding the bike off pavement since I now had the whole day under my belt. I spent the night in Covington, Virginia. I knew this was a paper mill town the moment I got there because the smell was pretty all-encompassing. I noticed that I'd left my only USB-C cable back at Pat's in Damascus, so I went to a dollar store and bought a cable that was too long and overpriced so that I could recharge my GoPro batteries. Unfortunately, this overly long and overpriced cable was awful and it made my charge time increase by about 4 times. I've never seen that happen before. On a better note, I stayed at a place called the Evergreen Inn, which had a very nice room, and it was thankfully far enough out of town that you couldn't smell the paper mill anymore. But it was still close enough that you could have food delivered there, which I did. With that, day 1 of the BDR was complete. It was extremely cold when I started just past 8 in the morning. The first few bits of video I recorded aren't really usable because of how fogged up the GoPro lens got. I had to switch from using my helmet's visor to using goggles because of that fog, but that meant my face got way colder in the wind. Still, I guess that's better than being blind on the road. Section 3 is the longest single section, and this is the only day where I only did a single section. The way I planned this trip was thorough, but that did bring in some stress. I booked every place I stayed at in advance so I wouldn't run into a situation where I couldn't find something at the end of the day. Looking back, I can see now that on some days this wouldn't have been a problem at all. On others though, everything was pretty booked up because it was the beginning of leap viewing season, and I'm pretty sure there would have been days where I wouldn't have been able to find a place to stay without having a really big detour. In any case, having these reservations meant I had to complete sections fully each day or lose my chance to do them, so there was always a bit of time pressure on me while I was riding. With Section 3, this was less true, since as I said before, it is the only section I'd ride for this day. I started nice and early and I didn't expect any trouble finishing on time. It is considered pound for pound the most technical section, so I decided to try to take it easy since I had the whole day anyway. In the morning that was simple enough, since it was too damn cold to ride fast. As the day went on, I definitely encountered some of the most technical stuff I ended up seeing on the whole trip. Rocky, rutted out sections of narrow trail that would go on for miles and required a lot of concentration. This was counteracted by some more chill sections that would cut through grassy fields and even had some actual packed dirt, which I always liked riding on more than gravel. These sections were probably some of my favorites on the entire BDR. I love the moment where you'd pop out of the canopy of the forest and you'd see these lush fields on either side of you. Occasionally there'd be some cows, but they didn't seem particularly interested in me. I did see a fair amount of white-tailed deer, though none threatened to cause any crashes. I saw some other random wildlife as well, like turkeys, a lizard, a turtle, and an opossum. Section 3 has at least 2 water crossings, the depths of which can vary greatly on any given day depending on how the weather's been. It had been pretty dry when I did this, so I didn't expect them to be too massive, but I wasn't sure. Pat told me they were kind of tricky, since you'd really only know you'd done all of the water crossings once you finished the final off-road section and got back onto the twisty paved roads. I saw several of what can only be described as puddles along my way, but the 2 actual water crossings I encountered weren't that much more impressive. Keep in mind, you're seeing these via the wide-angled GoPro lens. In reality, they had steeper descents and they were longer, but not by that much. On the first one shown here, I stuck my right foot out a bit for balance and managed to bounce it off a rock, which made me feel dumb, but otherwise these crossings were really uneventful. If you search for videos of MABDR water crossings, you can see footage of people doing way more intense crossings, which must be done at times of the year where there's been a lot more water. I ended this section in Moorfield, West Virginia. I stayed at what I'd call a glamp ground, called Love's Way Village. I was the only person using the campground since it was late into the season and it was a weeknight, so it was definitely quiet. The woman running the place had a Scottish accent, and she seemed deeply impressed that I recognized it as such. After a few days of hearing only what I would consider southern accents, at least by my Canadian standard, I was just not expecting it. She provided me with a second space heater since the temperatures were supposed to get low overnight, and I was very comfortable in the glamping tent. Day 3 stands out by having the most mileage in a day, but I wasn't worried about it. Section 4 is nearly entirely paved, and while it does go over some narrow mountain roads, the average speed stayed very high for most of it. This section has a lot of touristy stuff to do along the way, especially for those interested in history. I'm normally all for that kind of thing, but earlier that summer I'd done a different road trip in Quebec with my girlfriend. We'd done most of the typical historical stuff on that trip, so this time I really wanted to focus on riding instead. I was also hesitant to really linger anywhere for too long, considering I was still doing 2 sections, easy or no. I ate lunch at the end of Section 4, in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. It's a really nice small town with some obviously historic buildings and an overall really nice aesthetic. I found a small restaurant for lunch right on the edge of the downtown area. After, I started Section 5, and it began largely paved. I thought it was pretty cool to see both the Potomac and the Shenandoah rivers, names I'd heard many times before but never seen in person. At Harper's Ferry, I crossed over both in quick succession. The end of Section 5 has Michaud State Forest, which stood out because it was one of the highest speed off-pavement sections of the entire trip. It's probably because this bit was more like a very well-tamped gravel road, rather than a trail, but after a full day of pavement it was pretty nice anyway. As a whole, this day was pretty relaxed and easy, especially compared to the previous 2, so it was a pretty good rest day, but it doesn't rate hugely in terms of memorability, at least for me. Maybe that'd be different had I done more of the historic stuff, but I was too worried about running out of time. I ended up in Mount Holly Springs, Pennsylvania. This time, I stayed in a traditional Airbnb, a bedroom in a family's house. They're very nice and had a good, clean room for me to use. Incidentally, the father of the family was a Canadian from Ontario, which isn't something I was expecting. I ate dinner in a bar which was used heavily by Appalachian Trail hikers. Like Damascus from the beginning of day 1, this is a trail stop town. I've been fascinated by the AT for many years, so I told myself if I ever bring myself to do it, I'm going to stop back in this town for sure. I made a dumb mistake in my planning and I didn't realize it until the end of this day, but let's come back to that. Section 6 marked a return to state forests and forest roads, especially compared to the previous day. The trails through the woods were not as technical as what I'd done in Virginia, and overall my confidence was way up after I'd now ridden so much gravel and dirt. I was also getting really used to the bike as well, having sat on it all day every day for 7 days in a row at this point. I was feeling good, and when I hit the end of the section in McVeytown, Pennsylvania, I filled up my gas and I noticed that there was a cafe across the way from the gas station. Here's where I'm going to admit that I'm a bit of a coffee snob. I'd largely been drinking whatever was available wherever I was, and just living with the fact that it was going to be mediocre. I did bring an AeroPress and some coffee from home, but busting that out was only really worth doing in some situations. Generally speaking, I took what I could get. McVeytown is a town of a few hundred inhabitants, bordering some state forests. Forgive my unfair assumptions, but my hopes for the cafe weren't especially high going in. Still, it would be hot, and they'd probably have something to eat, so in I went, to Venturous Coffee Roasters. Actually, the fact that it had roasters in the name was kind of intriguing, and it did say espresso on the window, but I didn't want to get my hopes up. I ordered some kind of breakfast sandwich and a cappuccino. The barista asked me if I was sure I wanted that, saying it would be quite bitter and it wouldn't have any sugar or syrup in it. This threw me off for a second, but actually it confirmed what I wanted, so I went ahead and ordered. I'm sorry I doubted you, McVeytown. That was truly a fantastic coffee. After I drank it, I put my gear back on and prepared to head out. I was looking down for whatever reason, and right before I walked out, a pair of very familiar looking boots entered my vision. Unmistakably, off-road motorcycle boots. I looked up to see their owner, and that's how I met Ezekiel. I said at the beginning that I rode the MABDR mostly solo, and the reason for that is I rode the entirety of Section 7 with this guy that I met at the cafe. He rode his Royal Enfield Himalayan, a machine I'd never seen outside of a YouTube video before, and together we tackled Section 7, including the expert sections, bolstered by the confidence of not being alone. Poe-Patty drop was pretty intense. The thing that made it most nerve-wracking was how sharp the big rocks looked. Both of us were cringing over some of them, hoping not to get a flat. Thankfully, we didn't, and we came out the other side without incident. We even took a random turn down some single track, and while it was pretty fun, we ended up meeting a fallen tree and having to turn around. The short expert sections and even a few of the technical sections on the main trail were some of the MABDR's most challenging, but none of them were long, maybe a few hundred meters each. Tub Run Road from the first day didn't have a single moment that was as complex to ride, but it lasted for much longer and required sustained focus over a long period of time, which I think is overall more tiring and more difficult. The end of Section 7 saw me and my newfound friend Ezekiel split up, however, because of that mistake that I alluded to at the beginning of this bit. I'd booked my night at the Huntington Motor Inn in Huntington, Pennsylvania, and I messed up my planning because Huntington is basically located at the end of Section 6, not Section 7, where I just finished. So I had to eat an hour-and-a-half drive down a main road all the way back to Huntington. This would have been fine, except that the following day was supposed to rain, and I still had to finish both Sections 8 and 9, and now I had this hour-and-a-half starting penalty. The motor inn was okay, an affordable motel, but clean and nothing wrong with it. I met a few fellow Canadian ADV riders, and they weren't doing the BDR but some other trails in the area, so we went out to dinner together. We talked hockey and other things, but the clouds continuously grew darker and moved in. Day 5 started with it raining down pretty hard outside. I was up early, but seeing the weather made me think that I wasn't going to be able to finish this thing. I decided I'd wait around the motel a while to see if it cleared before heading down the main road back to the beginning of Section 8, where I should have finished the day before. I assumed I'd be okay to do Section 8, but I might have to skip Section 9 if it took a while because my accommodations for the night were pretty deep into New York State, and getting there before dark was important. Getting a later than usual start and having to ride back to the end of Section 7 in a drizzle didn't give me high hopes, but by the time I got to Hartleton, the weather had cleared up considerably. As a whole, speeds in Pennsylvania had been higher than in Virginia because the gravel was tamped down harder and you could ride it more like a paved road rather than a trail, at least as long as the elevation changes weren't too severe. This continued to hold true for most of Section 8. There was one bit with steep switchbacks and I had a little incident where I picked a crap line, bounced over a large rock, and then stalled. The result of this was me and the bike tipping over onto our side. After I pried my leg out, I picked the bike back up and marveled how light it was. Then I continued on my way, glad no one had seen this embarrassing moment. It was the only drop I had on the whole trip, which isn't too bad, but I found it kind of annoying since it happened on the last day, kind of near the end too. Apart from my slightly bruised palm where my hand hit it on a rock when I fell over, no damage done, so I got on with it. I managed to complete Section 8 in very good time, considering the late start and huge time loss from the badly placed motel booking. With enough daylight left to try it, I took the chance and I decided to do Section 9 as well. This was a short and easy section, and I don't think it lasted much more than 2 hours start to finish. It had more state forest roads, but nothing even remotely technical, especially compared to the downhill that I'd fallen over on in the previous section. So I'm glad I didn't abandon it, since after I got to the New York sign in Lawrenceville, Pennsylvania, right on that border, I managed to do the entirety of the MABDR, finally including some of the optional expert sections. I did this whole thing in 5 days, and except for Section 7, all by myself as well. The trail done, I motored up to my Airbnb for the night, and that was it. Five days and 1,600 kilometers later, I can definitely say that I enjoyed my time on the MABDR. It was a fun ride with a lot more varied scenery and terrain than I had expected going in, but you do have to take it for what it is though. If what you're looking for is a technical challenge in off-road riding, I don't think this route will satisfy, especially not when it's dry like it was in my experience. If you really want to go somewhere isolated and totally removed from civilization and people, this also is not the route for you. You're never really going to be more than an hour or so away from a town, and frequently you're going to pass within a few hours of major population centers. It's great if you ever need a bike part or a piece of camping gear, but it isn't the deep wilds. It's the geographic nature of the Mid-Atlantic. It's been settled for a very long time, at least by North American standards. I think it holds up well as just a fun ride on nice roads, whether they're paved or not. A few shorter sections have some technical challenge here and there, but nothing that's extreme or insurmountable. One thing I really enjoyed is there weren't really any long slog sections, the kind where you're just motoring on to get to the next good part. Nothing ever really lasted long enough to get repetitive or boring. If I'd been riding a long gravel road through a state forest, just as I'd reached the point where I kind of started zoning out, then I'd get hit with a paved twisty section or something like that. It would change up frequently, and I really appreciated that. I said earlier I wasn't the most experienced off-road rider. Doing this route on a lightweight dual sport rather than a full or even mid-size ADV bike was definitely the right choice for myself. I was never worried about managing the bike at any point, and that made the whole experience better for me. In a group, a big bike would be fine because you can always get some help to get out of a problem. Alone though, I would definitely recommend sticking with a small machine. As for the CRF itself as that small machine, well, both the route and my own skills were very far below what that kind of machine is capable of. That's not necessarily a bad thing either. A suspension that can soak up huge jumps can also ride over a few rocks, and a motor meant to tear up desert races can put that power down on a paved mountain pass or a tamped gravel road just as well. So I didn't use the bike to its full extent or anything, but I still got to enjoy its capabilities from time to time. The one thing I would fault the bike on is that it can stall out very easily at low speed, even with the Vortex ECU. This behavior, mixed in with my bad line choice and me being slow to clutch, led to my one and only tip over. While it would be considered a less capable bike, I don't think my old DRZ would have stalled out in the same situation, and I might have gotten away with it. That's not the CRF's fault, but just an example of how all that capability can have some drawbacks. A bike meant to ride with the throttle wide open is going to be a little twitchier at low speeds. The maintenance intervals are another thing to mention, but I knew this going in. I planned for that oil change arriving in Virginia, and of course I had to do more maintenance when I got back home. It was manageable in this case, but you have to consider it if this bike is something that interests you. I think if I wanted to ride a West Coast BDR, for example, I'd have a lot more trouble as there would be valve checks to do along with those oil changes when we're talking about those kind of distances. Of course, you could trailer it, and the problem goes away, but that's a whole other topic. So I think that's it. I liked the ride a lot, had a great time, and generally thought my bike was pretty fun to ride on it. If you're thinking about the MABDR and you want to do it, understand that it's not wildly technical. But if you're not very experienced and you go alone, I would still recommend a smaller bike. If you have lots of experience or some buddies to go with, I'd imagine that anything with some ground clearance and knobby tires could do the job. Thanks very much for watching this video, and I hope you have a good one. Peace.